project for encoding and decoding. Last week we talked about encoding and decoding p-lists. P-lists are what's native to iOS and Swift. Okay, they're just property lists. But the reality is we need to deal with JSON data. So any of our web-based data is going to be JSON data. If we're dealing with RESTful APIs or anything like that, it's going to be JSON data. So this is kind of a build-up to actually dealing with those web APIs. So we know that when we make requests for data to get data, it's going to come back as RESTful data. It's going to come back as JSON data more than likely. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create an application where we're encoding and decoding JSON. Okay, and then we'll complicate things from there. Okay, so I'm just gonna call this JSON encoding. And it's not just JSON encoding, it's JSON encoding and decoding. So maybe a better name. And due to the fact that we're not using a web-based API, what I want to do is I want to have two separate data types. So I want to have one data type that we, let's just say that we're dealing with students. And then I want to, from those students, I want to bring back people. Okay, and that might not be a one-to-one mapping with properties, right? Like, students will have additional attributes that people wouldn't. People have additional attributes that students, well, I guess students will have all the people data. But it's not necessarily a one-for-one mapping. Like last week when we were dealing with p-lists, it's like, here's the data, let's decode it and encode it, and it's just a one-for-one mapping. So to kind of hack through this example, because we don't have two different data sets, what I want to do is I want to have two different classes. Okay? We'll encode one and decode it into another. Okay, so we're going to go from one type to another. That's kind of the plan. So before we do that, though, let's just work on encoding JSON just like we did with a p-list. I have an object, I encode it and decode it. Like I need to be able to save it to disk and then recover it from disk. So that's kind of the simple solution for the time being. So let's do that first. I'm going to start with a class definition. So let's just start with a student. So our student class, we want to make it codable, right? So we can encode it and decode it. So our class is going to be codable, and then we need some attributes. Like, so we care about their first name and last name and student ID and email, number of credits, so some int, required credits, progress. Okay, and it's not going to allow me to deal with this as a double. So it's going to do integer division. I don't want integer division. I want okay. This is my student class. I need an init method for my student class because I don't have any values, so I need my init method. So I'll take the first as a string, last is a string, ID is a string, email is a string, credits as an int, required credits as an int. Okay, so I would just want to map those incoming parameters to the instance variables. Okay, so there's my initializer. So I can create instances of student objects. And it doesn't, I don't have to set that progress. Oh, thank you. It's just ID. There we go. Okay, so there's my student class. What I want to do is I want to create a couple of students, and then I want to encode those and save them to disk. Okay, so if I go to my view controller, I'm going to have a method called encode students. No parameters, no return type. I'm just going to do some stuff. I'm going to have encode students. I'm going to have decode students. And then in order to do that, I'm going to need a place to store them. So I'm going to have a function that will get me my URL, that will return a URL. So really what we're talking about is encode to JSON, write to disk. Here we're talking about read from disk and decode from JSON. That's ultimately what we want to do. Okay, so then in order to do this, I want to get the user's documents URL again. So we did that last week. So docs URL is going to be equal to our file manager dot default dot it's files, right? No, URLs. And then I'm going to have a search directory. I want the documents directory. I have to search for the document directory. And then I just want the user mask, so I'm only looking in this specific mask. It brings back a collection of URLs. I don't want a collection of URLs. I just want the first one that's going to map. Okay, so that's my documents URL. I need to have a file name attached to it. So this is just a directory path. Like that docs URL is just a directory path if we're talking about like a normal file system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's return the docs URL. I want to append a path component, which is going to be the file name. So in our case, we're talking about students. And then I'm going to be appending a path extension. The path extension will be JSON. So my file name is going to be students.json, and it's going to be in that user's documents directory. That's what that URL is indicating. Okay? Okay, so when we encode students, I need a JSON encoder. So here's my encoder. Encoder is going to be a JSON encoder. And then what I want to do is I want to take that encoder and encode some encodable item. My students. I don't have any students yet. All right, so let's create some students. Then we'll come back to this encode method. Okay, so this class will have some students. I'm going to make it an array of student equal to, and then here's a student object. First, Bill, last, Gates, ID 1, email, bgates@msn.com. Let's say he has 84 credits of 120 that are required. So there's one student. And then I just want to create a couple of students. So Steve Jobs as jobs@mac.com. I think he graduated. I don't know that for sure. Why is this complaining? Oh, the ID. I think he graduated. One last student. So Jeff at Amazon. He didn't get very far. Okay. So I have a collection of student objects. That's based on my class definition. It has all the information about my students. And then we build that collection of students. We want to deal with that collection of students. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to encode that students collection. I don't know why I ended up in student. Okay, this is a throwable method, meaning I have to try to do this. And what's going to happen is when I encode this, it's saying take this collection of student objects, so a collection of Swift student objects. When I encode them, what I really mean is I want to take that collection of Swift student objects, convert them over to like a string of JSON data. So I want to try to do this. It's a throwable method, meaning I could have an exception. I want to try to see if that's actually going to work. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if I can create some variable called encoded students. So if I can do that, then life's good. Encoded students is a data object. So what I want to do is just print that JSON data just so you can see what the JSON data looks like before we write it to disk. Like eventually I should be able to just take encoded students and then there's a write method. Eventually I should be able to do that, but what I want to do is I want to print those encoded students. So I can't just print data because it's just going to come back as a bunch of binary data that I can't see. So what I want to do is I want a string where I set the data equal to this encoded students, and I want to say the encoding is equal to UTF-8 encoding. So I'm basically taking that data and converting it to a readable UTF-8 string. Yeah, it's fine there. So what I want to do is just take a look. Does that actually look good? And what we should see is we should see the output of that encoded students collection should be a JSON collection. Square brackets, curly braces, key value pairs. I think that's the idea. So when I run this, eventually we get our collection of objects. So here's the first object for the first student. That's highlighted. And what's happening is it's escaping all the double quotes because it's a string and it's saying, hey, there's double quotes inside of the string, which is from the JSON data, indicating those are the keys or the string values. This is the data. This is what I want to write to the file system. This is what I could expect from a web service. Like this is the response that I might get from a web service saying, hey, give me the students at MATC that are enrolled in this class. Like if I had an iPhone application saying, you know, here's my class roster, this is the data that I'd expect back. Something like this. Okay, so we're able to print the data. Let's go ahead and write that data to disk then. So I have encoded students. So I want to take the encoded students, it's a data object. I want to write it to my specific URL. So I know the URL. It's this return value from this getURL method. So let's just use that method. And then the options are no file protection. I want to be able to overwrite the file as the data changes. And it says, hey, that can throw an exception, but it's not marked, so I want to try that. So we're writing them to disk. Okay, great. Seems like a reasonable thing to do. What I want to do is I want to cheat a little bit here. I'm going to go over to my student list, and I'm going to implement the custom string convertible protocol. And I need a description then. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to return just the first and last name of the student. So I'm going to say, you know, here's the first name and the last name. Okay, that's my implementation for that custom string convertible. And the reason I want to do that is if I go to my storyboard, sorry, not my storyboard, my view controller, I want to, I'm going to take out this print statement where I'm printing the JSON data. I'm going to print my students. Okay, so we should just see that array of data, and it's going to call that custom string convertibles description method. So we'll see my 4 students' first and last names when I run this. Okay, there's my array with my 4 students. What I want to do is, after I've encoded the students, meaning I've encoded them and stored them to disk, I've saved them essentially. I probably want my comments reflecting the code. It'd be good. After I've done that, I'm going to clear all of these students. Students. Remove all. It's empty. And we should be able to see that. So if I print students, and the way I'm going to handle this is I'm going to say after removing all, okay, so now I should see an empty array. Okay, so really I'm just proving to you that the array is empty, right? So we started, we had students, we were able to print out those students, we saved them to disk, so they're on the file system. That JSON data is on the file system. We clear it out, and what I want to show you is that, okay, we've cleared it out, we can reload that data from disk now by decoding those students. Like that's what I want to do, is I want to decode the student objects so that we can see them again. Okay, so I want to let my decoder, it's going to be equal to a JSON decoder. Okay, and then I want to initialize some data. And I'm going to initialize it, and if I look, there's an init from the contents of a URL. It's data.init from the contents of a URL. And I wonder if it's failing because I have to actually try catch that. Okay, so I'm trying to initialize some data from a file off the file system. So what I want to do is I want to get that data object. So I'm just going to say if let data equals all that stuff. So if I can get the data off the file system, then I can do something. Then I should be able to, if let decoded students equal to try, because again, it's going to throw an exception if I don't, I should be able to use my decoder to decode. I'm going to decode data, but in order to do that, I'm going to get an array of student objects. Whoops. From data. So if I actually get a collection of decoded students, then I should be able to assign that to that collection of students. And if I've done that correctly, then I should be able to then print out all my students again. After decoding. So now we should see all three steps, right? We start with our initial grouping of students, we write them to disk, we clear the collection, and then I'm never decoding the students, so I don't see that third set. So I start with all of them, I write it to disk, I remove them all, and then I never reload them because I never actually call the method to reload them. Life's good. It's almost too easy when it works, right? How's that happen? Not that much different than last week, right? Like we used a plist encoder and decoder, but essentially the exact same thing that we did last week. So nothing is changing all that much when we work with JSON versus plist. Okay, so just a different encoder type. Here's where things are going to get different though. Okay, so this is just kind of a review from last week. We're all on the same page. We're able to get URLs. We're able to write to our file system. We're able to get data from the file system and write to the file system. So that's good. Where we run into problems though is, let's say I encode a collection of students. Like consider that my API. That's the data that I have on the file system. So that's the data that I have available to me. And what I want to bring back is people. And people don't necessarily have the same attributes. Like they're not going to have a student ID. They're not going to have credits, required credits, progress. Like they're just not going to have that information. It's not necessary. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to encode a collection of students, and then I have data for students. It's going to be on the file system. What I want to do is I want to pull back a collection of people when I decode this. So I'm going to add another class called person. I'm just going to copy and paste the student class, and then we can kind of work from there. Okay, this is going to be my person class. Still want a first name, still want a last name, don't want a student ID, don't want credits, don't want required credits, don't want progress. Okay, same thing with this initializer. No longer need credits or required credits. How did I ever do that without a student ID? Oh, I have it, I just didn't see it. There we go. So we just have first name, last name, email. Okay, so great. I don't need the student ID. I don't need credits. I don't need required credits. I don't need the calculated field. So my person is kind of a dumbed down student. Okay? That makes sense? Yeah. 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 What I want to do is I don't want to get rid of the code to decode students. what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another function decode students to people. Okay? So I'm going to have func decode students to people. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is going to be the same thing, right? Like it's a lot of the same stuff. And I guess I should probably fix the comments. Okay, except I don't want to decode into students. I want to decode into person objects. And I'm going to call this my decoded people. And I don't want to store a local variable. I don't want an instance variable. I just have my decoded people. So after decoding, I'm just going to print out my decoded people. Okay. So I just added another method. I didn't get rid of the encode and decode students. But now I want to add one more method where I'm trying to do a type conversion. So on disk, I have students, and I want to bring them back as people. Or maybe I have a service that's getting all the students, and I'm mapping my students because now I want to say, these are graduates, and I have new information about the graduates. Like I want to know where they're working and how much they're getting paid and what field and stuff like that, so we can collect data on those graduates. Right? They're no longer students, they're graduates. Different data type. Don't have the same fields. Don't care about how many credits you had anymore. Don't care about your GPA. You graduated. We're treating everyone the same. Okay, so same type of conversion here. We're converting students over to people. Okay, so I want to try that. All right, so I want to decode students to people. This fails if I don't have an exact mapping. Yeah. So when I say it fails if I don't have an exact mapping, it worked, right? Is everyone okay with that? So I want to show you what it looks like. Like I want to just make sure my labeling is correct after decoding into people. You're going to see it works fine. It's this one right here. And the reason it worked just fine is because the attributes were named exactly the same, right? When I went from students over to person, I left the attributes exactly the same. I just removed some. Okay? But as long as they have a one-for-one mapping from here's the key value pairs that are in that JSON file, as long as that class name, as long as that all matches up, life's good. So what I want to do is I want to change things. So I don't have a one-for-one mapping. Okay, so I'm going to go to my person, and they're no longer going to have a first name. They're just going to have first, last, and then email address. I'm changing everything. Like I don't need to, but it doesn't hurt anything. So first, last, first, last, and then email address. Okay, so the class definition's okay. But it's now different. I don't have the same attributes that in my person class, I don't have the same attributes that I did in my student class. Okay, and additionally, what happens if I add another attribute? Okay, so my person is going to have a home address. This would have broke things as well. Okay, so now I try to run this. You'll notice I never get after decoding to people. Why not? Okay, so I have a try block that just bonks out of it. Is that okay?
It depends on what you mean okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Your program didn't crash.
yeah, my program didn't crash, but is that really what I want? Like, I'm trying to build the application. I'd like to know that that didn't work, right? Be nice to know. So how do I determine that? So I'm going to argue that it failed right here on this decode. Like that's where it failed. I'm telling you that just because it's an easy thing. What I want to do is I want to do this. So I want to do this stuff. And I no longer want to optionally try this. I want to try it. And if I run into a problem, I'm going to catch it. I don't like that indentation, but use of local variable get before its declaration. I must have a mismatched. Yeah, I do. I'm going to let that variable equal to the try. Yeah. I'm like, why is it indenting this for me? It looked off to me. So I'm going to do this stuff. It's kind of like my try-catch blocks. I do these things and then catch any exceptions. Okay, so all I'm going to do is print the error. This error object is automatically given to you in your catch block. And now I'll see the error.
So you don't have to catch a specific type of exception.
You can.
This is just
Yeah, this is just generic. Key not found. First. Yeah, that's a pretty reasonable error, right? Okay, so now I'm getting errors, right? I might say, hey, the error occurred in this method, so when I catch the error, I might want to give detail about where I found the error. There's additional information about the error, but I just find that useful. I code around it so often that sometimes when you're just trying to get things to work, it's like, no, I need to know what the error is. Like, why is this not working? Over the weekend, I was working on the book demo of like consuming data from an API, and their data is like from the astronomy image of the day. So I was just kind of going through the book example of calling that API, and it wouldn't work. I'm like, why the heck is this not working? And then turns out like the image from the weekend was a video, not an image, and I was trying to put it into a UI image. And then later in the book, it talks about, oh yeah, sometimes it's a video. Okay. Like, and they're like, it's beyond the scope of the book to handle video, so don't worry about it. And so then I'm like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. And then I was able to change it to a specific date to get an image, and then it worked fine. But yeah, it's like, I don't know what the error is because I keep working around it, and it would just crash when I try to do something, and I just avoid the error. It wasn't crashing my application, it just wasn't working like we're having here. Well, now it's crashing. And when I say crashing gracefully, right? Like the application's still running. Like I caught the error, I figured out what the error is, the application's still running, life's good. So sometimes I prefer this. Okay, so we don't have that key, right? Our data has a first name, but we're trying to map it to first. And our data has a last name, and we're trying to map it to last. And our data has an email, and we're trying to map it to email address. We screwed up all the mappings, right? So in order to handle this, we need to go back to our person class. And when we want to change those mappings, we have to implement a specific coding keys protocol, which is an enumerated type that basically says, here's the keys that are coming in, how do they map to this object? So I need an enum called coding keys that takes a string and maps it to a coding key. Okay, and basically it's going to say, you know, I'm taking the first name and I'm mapping it to first. And I'm taking the last name and mapping it to last. and I'm taking the email and mapping it to the email address. That's my mappings that I want to set up. And that can be anything, right? Like your service says the key value pairs are XYZ, you want to map them to ABC. Okay, this is how you do it. Like this attribute maps to my class's attribute on the right-hand side. So the right-hand side is this class's attributes. Okay, in addition to this, one additional thing that I have to do, so you'll see it doesn't conform to the protocol decodable. I got that error now because I implemented this enum for coding keys. I have to describe how to initialize a new instance of a person from a decoder. So I have this init method saying, hey, if you pass in all this information, this is how it initialize a new person. I have another init method, so I'm going to overload the init method saying, hey, if I'm initializing a person from a decoder, this is how I should initialize that person. I'm going to have another init method. And this will throw an exception if it doesn't work, so I have to have that throws. And I think I might even have to have the fact that this is a required initializer. Okay, in order to do this, I need a value container. This is where that coding keys enum comes in. And then the value container, what it'll do is I can get all of those different values. So I can say I want to grab the first name. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to I'm going to go to my value container. And I'm going to decode. Decoding a string for a specific key, so the coding keys dot first. And I'm going to keep doing that, so self dot last. I'm going to try to go to my value container. I'm going to try to decode. Again, it's a string because it's the last name. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the email.
What's the reason behind the string.self? You did it with when you created that array before person array.self.
Yeah, so what it is just a data type. So instead of saying I want an instance of a string, I'm talking about the string data type. That's what I'm decoding this into. So if this was, like, let's say I wanted to decode this into a pet, like it might be something like pet.self. Right, so that we're really talking about the data type as opposed to an instance of that data type. So we're just talking about strings here because that's what the data types are. They're just simple data types.
It's just a different way of using that keyword because usually you see it out front. You know,
Yeah, yeah. So what it's basically saying is for that property, I'm trying to decode this into a string. Yeah.
That's just the way you
Yep. Why does this not conform to encodable? I think it should.
You still don't have home address defined as blank if you don't have the data part.
Yeah, you need.
I don't think I have to.
Well, then make it optional.
No, so I don't, oh yeah, I do have to make it optional because I can't create it without a home address. Coding case key does not match. I should be okay now, I think. I think it should. Oh, I'm mapping my stored attributes. I have these exactly reversed. So I want first map to the data that's going to come across as first name. I want last map to the data that's going to come across as last name, and email address to come across as the data that's mapped to email. Okay, now this is screwed up. So this is first, last, and email address. Now, I was going to say I wasn't optimistic, but it looks like it runs. I can almost promise you're going to implement all of this stuff. And like I was saying, we're kind of building up to those web-based APIs. So our API is going to return data. Unless I've written every single bit of code, I probably don't have a class that matches one for one to say, oh, this is what the API is returning. This is what my class needs. I'm probably just not going to do that. I don't need everything from the API. I probably need bits and pieces from the API. Like if I'm getting a collection of students and I want to map those to graduates, or people in our case, like I don't need everything. I don't care how many credits you took. I just need different data.
Here's a question, like, so if you have to, in the email, make the two match, like the first to first name, if you don't know what those variables are you're looking for on that right-hand side, is that just looking in the error logs and figuring out what?
Looking at the network traffic.
Just to see what?
Yep. So we can start to look at network monitoring too when we start to get to the web stuff. So you can see here's the data that's actually getting sent to you. And like, why is it not getting mapped correctly? So you could do it with error logging, but you can also do it with network monitoring. And there's network monitoring tools that are built into Swift. So like, as I make that request, I want to see like, hey, did my request look the way it should for that API request? And then is the API response what I'm expecting it to be? Sometimes it changes and you don't know, or like sometimes things are optional and you don't realize that they're optional and then they don't exist. And it's like, uh-oh. So right now, if I'm looking at this code, like I'm trying to do this, but I don't assign a value if it fails. So if that data was optional in some case, like I might want to do some kind of conditional operator to say, hey, it's an empty string if it's not. All right, so I could look for a conditional. I can't tell you how many times I do this, but it's the same. You know, it's like, hey, I'm getting this data set back, and now I need to map it to one of my objects. And it's not a one-for-one mapping, so like it's constant. I don't store data on my device. So in this class, it's kind of nice, like, hey, we can write data to disk. And for small applications, I think that's probably reasonable, but I just never do it because it's like you almost instantly grow out of it if your application is going to get used. So it's way nicer just to have a web service sitting on AWS to say, hey, store my data there in RDS, right? And then my data is in Amazon, and now if I want to build a web application on top of it, my mobile device is going to be sunk up with my web application. And all my data is in one spot, not on my device. And now I don't have to worry about like, oh, I did some work on my device. I have to sync up my device with the web application so that the web application knows about the changes I made on my phone. That just doesn't make any sense. Querying that is sometimes tough, though.
It's because you can't join.
So, like, you're probably too young into this career to remember a time when not all your phones were connected devices, and you didn't have an internet connection, and you didn't have a cellular connection. So a lot of times, what would happen is we would save data locally on that device, and then at some point you would have to sync up that data. That syncing process sucked so bad, because you'd run into merge conflicts like, hey, one user updated this record and another user updated this record, and like, how do I deal with that conflict? And as a programmer, I have no idea. And like, if you've ever used Git and had merge conflicts, like that's essentially what used to happen to you as a developer, and you had to like resolve those merge conflicts. And I had no idea how to resolve them.
Last one wins.
Yeah.
And people would get pissed off about that, right? Like, last one wins is easy to implement.
Yeah, right.
Like, oh, not my problem. But it's completely your problem. Because you look like the idiot programmer that didn't know how to write this. Like, oh, this person edited it, and then I made changes to like a stored copy of it, and now my changes aren't reflective of that person's changes. Like, that doesn't work. Okay, so that's all I wanted to really get through today is encoding and decoding data and those custom table view cells. Next week, we're going to get into closures. The lab is a little bit longer, so I'm kind of giving you a warning. Although, if you've dealt with closures before, so map, reduce, filter, it's similar. Like, Swift doesn't necessarily change that process. And I guess here you can take it one of two ways. Like, okay, I have to do a bunch of work, and I don't know how to do this, and it's going to take me a long time. If you haven't seen map, reduce, filter.
Can we assume it's similar to everything else that Swift does and just does it backwards?
No, I think it's pretty close to, like, JavaScript and Swift are pretty similar. And I guess the upside to this is I learn it in Swift, I also learn it in JavaScript. Or I know it in JavaScript, I also learn it in Swift. So it's not like, hey, I learn it in one spot and then it doesn't apply anywhere else. The syntax is a little bit different in Swift. So like when you say it's a little backwards, like the syntax is different. So it's not the same as JavaScript. Swift will argue JavaScript's backwards,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Apple and the rest of the world, okay?
Well, it used to be Microsoft in the rest of the world. So,
Yeah, that's true.
again, I mean, who's right, who's wrong?
There's always got to be somebody.
Yeah, there's always got to be a villain, right?
There's Epic and there's the rest of the world. I mean,
Yeah.
whatever these are.
So I'm going to stop here for today. Next week, we'll get into closures, and then the week after that, we'll get into those web-based APIs, which will implement those callbacks, which will require closures. Okay, so we'll kind of deal with the syntax. So it's going to deal with the encoding, decoding, closures. It's kind of all going to come together with those API requests. Okay, so I'll stop here for today. You do have a lab that's due. And like I said, if you're comfortable with it, I think it's a pretty easy lab. But if you're not comfortable with it, like, stay and get help. Okay, because it doesn't have to be that hard. You don't have to go do it on your own. Like, I can help you. So, like, the lab shouldn't be hard, but I guess you can make it hard if you want to. So I'm gonna